He came to the mountains to outrun memories that had the persistence of shadows, stretching long in the evening of his mind. Elias Vance had once moved through a world of noise and consequence, a world that had left him with a silence he could not fill and a debt he could not pay. He sought an exile in the high, lonely places, believing that enough quiet and enough distance could starve the ghosts. But his canine, a veteran as scarred and silent as himself, froze one morning on the trail. The dog, Ghost, had found something that was never meant to be disturbed, something buried deep beneath a forgotten fire lookout. It was a secret that would drag Elias back into the world of responsibility and moral consequence, forcing him to answer a question he had been running from for a decade. What do you do when you are the only one who knows the truth? Where are you watching from tonight as this story unfolds?
Let us know in the comments, and be sure to like and subscribe to this channel so we can walk this path together. The air in this part of the Cascades had a different texture. It was thicker, heavier with the scent of pine and damp, ancient earth. Elias breathed it in, a slow, measured intake that did nothing to loosen the knot just below his ribs. It had been there for 10 years, a permanent resident in the house of his body. He walked with the quiet economy of a man who had learned long ago that wasted movement was a liability. His worn leather boots made little sound on the carpet of fallen needles, a path only dear and forgetting men seemed to use. Above him, the sky was a sheet of polished steel, promising a cold night. His uniform never changed. An olive M65 field jacket, its fabric softened by 1,000 cycles of wear and weather, served as a shell against the world. Beneath it, a plaid flannel shirt, the colors muted by sun and time. His cargo pants were functional, their pockets holding the few tools he deemed essential. A folding knife with a blade sharpened to a razor's edge, a compass that had guided him through landscapes far less forgiving than this one, and a small, waterproof tin of tinder. On his wrist, the heavy, reassuring weight of a military-issue marathon watch, its tritium vials still glowing faintly in the dim light. It was a relic from his other life, a timekeeper for a world he had abandoned, but that had not abandoned him. Beside him, moving with a fluid grace that belied his age, was Ghost. The German shepherd's muzzle was a distinguished silver gray, and his dark, intelligent eyes missed nothing. He was not a pet. He was a partner. Theirs was a companionship forged in the crucible of shared duty, and their communication had evolved beyond words into a language of posture, breath, and the subtle shift of weight.
Ghost was never entirely off duty. His senses always extended, a perimeter of vigilance that allowed Elias a measure of peace the mountains alone could not provide. The dog carried his own burdens, visible in the slight stiffness of his gait on cold mornings, and the way he would sometimes whine softly in his sleep, his legs twitching as he ran through dreams of his own. They were making for a destination Elias had spotted on an old topographical map, a point marked Angel's Perch Lookout. The name was a piece of poetry in a landscape of harsh angles and pragmatic names like Widowmaker Ridge and Bear Creek. The tower, according to the map's legend, had been decommissioned in the late 70s. It was a ghost on a mountain, a fitting place for a man trying to become one. For 2 days they had climbed, leaving the last logging road far behind, pushing into a silence that was almost absolute.
It was this silence Elias craved. A vast, empty space he hoped could absorb the echoes in his head. But on the third morning, as the sun began to burn the mist off the high meadows, the silence broke. It was not a sound that broke it, but a sudden absence of one. Ghost, who had been trotting a few paces ahead, stopped. It was not a casual pause to sniff the air or investigate a scent. It was a full, rigid stop, his body locked, his head cocked at an unnatural angle. His breathing, usually a soft, steady pant, ceased.
The mountain seemed to hold its breath with him. Elias stopped too, his hand falling instinctively to the worn grip of the knife in his pocket. He scanned the trees, his eyes tracing the familiar patterns of bark and shadow, searching for the anomaly, the thing that did not belong. Bear? Cougar? He saw nothing. He heard nothing. The only sound was the faint whisper of wind through the firs and the frantic drumming of his own heart, a traitorous rhythm he had learned to ignore. "What is it, boy?" he murmured, his voice a rough, unused thing. Ghost did not look at him. His entire being was focused on a spot 50 feet ahead, just off the barely there trail. It was a small clearing, overgrown with fireweed and bracken. Nothing looked out of the ordinary, yet the dog's posture screamed a warning. His hackles were not raised in aggression, but his body was coiled with an intensity Elias had not seen since their last tour. This was not the alert posture for a predator. This was different. This was the posture for something fundamentally wrong. Slowly, methodically, Elias moved forward, placing his feet with deliberate care. He kept a wide berth around the spot Ghost was indicating, circling it, his senses on high alert. The air grew colder as he approached the clearing, a pocket of unnatural chill in the morning sun. He could smell the damp earth, but beneath it, there was another scent, faint and metallic, like old rust and decay. It was the smell of a forgotten thing, something the earth had tried and failed to digest. Ghost finally broke his stillness, but not to relax. He moved with stiff-legged purpose toward the center of the clearing, his nose to the ground. He circled a particular area, no larger than a dining table, his sniffing becoming more frantic. Then he began to dig. It was not the playful digging of a dog after a mole. It was a desperate, focused excavation, dirt and roots flying from beneath his powerful paws. Elias watched, the knot in his gut tightening. He trusted the dog's instincts more than his own. Ghost had saved his life more than once, not by fighting, but by listening to the world in a way humans had forgotten how to. He had sensed the subtle shift in air pressure before an ambush, smelled the chemical signature of a hidden explosive, heard the scrape of a boot on stone from 100 yards away. If Ghost said there was something here, there was something here. He unslung his Eberly stock half-track pack and pulled out a small entrenching tool, a habit he had never broken. He walked to where the dog was digging and gently nudged him aside. "Easy, boy. Let me." Ghost backed away but remained fixed on the spot, a low whine escaping his throat. Elias knelt. The ground was soft, loamy. He began to dig, the shovel biting easily into the earth. A few inches down, the blade struck something with a dull metallic thud. Not a rock. The sound was hollow, resonant. He scraped away the dirt around the point of impact, his curiosity now a sharp, demanding presence. He cleared a wider area, his movements becoming more urgent. The object was long and flat, a sheet of dark, rusted metal. He followed its edge, digging a trench along its length. It was wider than he expected, and as he uncovered more, a shape began to emerge. A curved roof, a series of small, square openings, their glass long gone. A row of rivets, like stitching on a steel shroud. His breath caught in his throat. It was the top of a vehicle, but it was too narrow for a truck, too long and too solid. The shape was achingly familiar, a memory from a black and white photograph in a history book. He was digging up a train car. A train car. Here, miles from any known track, buried on the side of a mountain beneath a derelict fire lookout. It made no sense. The nearest railway line was 50 miles away, down in the valley. The logistics of getting something this large and heavy this high were staggering. It was impossible. He scrambled back, his mind racing, trying to fit the pieces together. The decommissioned lookout, the forgotten trail, a buried railroad car. This was not an accident. An accident leaves a scar on the landscape, a trail of debris. This was a burial. Something had been brought here, interred, and deliberately forgotten. Ghost sat beside him, his breathing now steady. He rested his heavy head on Elias's knee, a rare gesture of comfort. The dog had done his job. He had found the anomaly. Now it was Elias's turn. The quiet he had sought was gone, replaced by 1,000 clamoring questions. He looked from the exposed curve of rusted steel back up the mountain toward the skeletal frame of the lookout tower silhouetted against the sky. Angel's Perch. It suddenly sounded less like poetry and more like a warning. He spent the rest of the day excavating, a grim, methodical labor. The sun climbed to its zenith and began its slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of orange and bruised purple. Elias worked without rest, driven by a need to understand the shape of the thing he had found. By dusk, he had uncovered the entire top and one long side of the car. It was a passenger car, old, from the early 20th century, its design archaic. The small, square windows were evenly spaced, and below them, faded but still legible, was lettering. He scraped away the caked-on dirt and rust with his knife, his hands raw. Orthern, Dominion, Rail. And below that, a smaller crest, a circle with a stylized fir tree. He had seen that crest before, in the small town at the base of the mountain range, on the side of a brick building that had once been the company headquarters. Northern Dominion Rail and Timber. The company had built the entire region, laying track, felling forests, founding towns. They had been gone for 50 years, swallowed by a larger corporation, their history relegated to dusty archives and the occasional plaque. This was one of their cars. But what was it doing here? He moved along the length of it, his hand trailing over the cold, pock-marked steel. He reached the end of the car and began to dig around the corner, searching for a door, an entrance. He found one, a sliding door, its mechanism long since seized by rust and time. But next to it was something else, something that made the cold dread in his stomach crystallize. It was a standard panel door, but it had been modified. A small sliding window, not much bigger than a hand, had been fitted into it at eye level, the kind one might see in a prison or an asylum. And below the window, a heavy-duty bolt had been welded to the outside, a thick iron pin securing it shut. This car was not designed to keep people out. It was designed to keep them in. He stood back, the full weight of the discovery settling on him. He looked at the sealed door, the barred window, the sheer isolation of the place. This was not a passenger car, not anymore. It had been repurposed. It was a cage, a tomb. A wave of nausea washed over him, a feeling he recognized. It was the same feeling that had hit him in a dusty village in the Hindu Kush, standing over the body of a man he was supposed to protect, a man whose trust he had held in his hands. It was the feeling of standing on the edge of a great and terrible injustice. His past, the one he had climbed a mountain to escape, had just found him at 10,000 feet. Paragraph Elias spent a cold, restless night camped beside the unearthed car. He built a small, smokeless fire, a skill honed in places where a wisp of smoke could be a death sentence. Ghost lay close, his body a warm, solid presence against Elias's back, but not even the dog's proximity could ward off the chill that had settled deep in his bones. The mountain was no longer a refuge. It was a witness. Its silence was no longer peaceful. It was accusatory. He ate a tasteless meal of dried rations, his eyes fixed on the dark, hulking shape of the rail car. It seemed to absorb the firelight, giving nothing back. His mind worked, turning over the impossible facts. Who would go to the monumental effort of hauling a train car up a mountain, digging a pit, and burying it? And why? Secrecy. The effort spoke of a desperate need to make something disappear. The welded bolt on the door spoke of what that something was. People. The memories came, unbidden, as they always did in the quiet hours before dawn. The scent of diesel and dust, the crackle of the radio, the weight of his rifle, the face of his partner, Ben, smiling at him just hours before everything went wrong. The impossible choice, the order to fall back, the sight of Ben, wounded, being overwhelmed as the evac chopper lifted off. He had followed orders. He had saved the mission. He had lost his friend. The official report called it a heroic sacrifice. Elias called it a failure of loyalty. He had left a man behind. It was the one sin he could not forgive himself for. He shook his head, pushing the images away. That was then. This was now. He looked at the train car. Here was another forgotten story, another set of lives sealed away. He couldn't change the past, but the rusted steel in front of him was the present. It was a solid, tangible thing. It demanded something of him. Morning came, gray and somber. He had a decision to make. He could walk away, rebury the car, hike back down the mountain and find another range, another valley, another place to lose himself. It was the sensible choice. It was the choice the man who had climbed this mountain would make. But the man who stood here now, his hands raw from digging, his mind snagged on the image of a bolted door, was not the same man. "We have to see what's inside," he said to Ghost. The dog looked up at him, his dark eyes steady, and gave a soft woof of agreement. It was a dry, internal joke Elias often had with himself that the dog was judging his every move, and in this case, had already decided on the correct course of action hours ago. Getting into the car would not be easy. The main door was a fortress of rust and steel. Prying it open would require leverage and tools he did not have. He circled the car again, examining every seam, every window. The small, square windows were his only hope. They were too small to climb through, but perhaps he could see something. He chose one near the center of the car and used the butt of his entrenching tool to shatter the remaining shards of thick, yellowed glass. He cleared the opening and shone his flashlight inside. The beam cut through decades of darkness, illuminating a scene of ordered decay. The interior was not what he expected. It was not a passenger car with rows of seats. It had been converted into a medical ward. Narrow cots, little more than metal frames with rotted canvas, lined both walls. Between them, a narrow aisle. Each cot had a small, overturned nightstand beside it. At the far end of the car, he could just make out the shape of a medical cabinet, its glass doors shattered. Dust motes, ancient and undisturbed, danced in the flashlight beam like tiny spirits. A thick layer of grime and mold covered everything. But there was no sign of a struggle. No bodies. The cots were empty, the thin blankets folded at the foot of each one. It was eerie, like a stage set left after the final curtain. He moved the light slowly, methodically, painting the scene. On one of the nightstands, a tin cup. Beside another, a book, its cover swollen and its pages fused into a solid block of mold. Then he saw it. On the floor, in the center of the aisle, was a metal footlocker. It was large, military style, and unlike everything else in the car, it seemed to have been placed with care. It was not overturned or covered in debris. It sat there, waiting. He knew, with a certainty that settled like a stone in his gut, that the answers were in that locker, but he couldn't reach it from the window. He had to get inside. He went back to the welded door. He examined the bolt. It was a thick pin of iron, slid through two heavy hasps that had been crudely welded to the door and the frame. The welds were thick and ugly, but strong. The pin itself was held in place by a simple cotter pin, rusted but intact. He took out his folding knife. The tip was fine and strong. For an hour, he worked at the cotter pin, chipping away the rust, carefully trying to bend the rusted legs back together. It was delicate, frustrating work. His fingers, numb with cold, fumbled with the small piece of metal. Twice the knife slipped, gashing his knuckles. He barely noticed. Finally, with a faint screech of protest, the cotter pin broke. Now for the bolt. It was heavy and seized tight by the rust. He had no hammer. He looked around, his gaze falling on a piece of granite about the size of his fist that he had unearthed earlier. He fetched it, and using it as a crude mallet, began to tap at the end of the iron pin. The sound was a dull thud, absorbed by the heavy steel. He struck it again, harder. A cloud of rust dust puffed from the hasp. A millimeter of movement. For the next 2 hours, that was his world. The rhythmic, jarring impact of stone on iron. His arm ached, his knuckles bled, but he did not stop. He was no longer just a man trying to open a door. He was a man trying to break a seal, to let light into a dark place. He was fighting against the weight of time, against the deliberate act of forgetting. Each blow was a question. Who were you? What happened here? Why were you left behind? With a final groaning shriek of tortured metal, the pin slid free. It fell to the ground with a heavy clang that echoed in the unnatural quiet. The door was unbolted. He put his shoulder to it and pushed. Nothing. It was sealed shut by 50 years of rust and pressure from the earth that had once covered it. He needed leverage. He looked at his entrenching tool. The handle was wood, the shovel head steel. Not long enough, not strong enough. His eyes scanned the surrounding forest. He needed a pole. A young, strong tree. He found a lodgepole pine, about 6 inches in diameter at its base, growing 20 yards away. He didn't have an axe. He had his knife. It was a fool's task, but he began anyway, methodically cutting a deep V into the base of the tree. It took hours. The sun was setting again by the time the tree groaned and fell with a soft whoosh into the undergrowth. He stripped the branches, his hands sticky with sap. He now had a 20-foot lever. He dragged the heavy pole to the rail car and wedged one end into the seam of the sliding door. Using a large rock as a fulcrum, he put his entire weight on the end of the pole. The wood creaked. The pole bent. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sound like tearing fabric, a sliver of darkness appeared in the door seam. Rust flaked away. He reset the pole and pushed again. The gap widened. He worked the pole back and forth, 1/4 of an inch at a time. The sound was horrific, a screeching, grinding protest from the metal. It was the sound of a tomb giving up its dead. Finally, the gap was wide enough for him to squeeze through. He was exhausted, covered in dirt, sap, and his own dried blood. He took his flashlight, took a deep breath, and slid into the darkness. The air inside was stale and cold, thick with the smell of mold and decay, and something else, something faintly medicinal and sad. He stood for a moment, letting his eyes adjust, the flashlight beam cutting a solitary path through the gloom. The silence in here was different. It was a heavy, pressurized silence, the silence of a place that had held its breath for half a century. He walked slowly down the narrow aisle, his boots crunching on fallen plaster and shattered glass. The cots were like skeletal remains on either side of him. He ran his hand over the rotted canvas of one. It crumbled to dust at his touch. This was a place of profound sorrow. He could feel it in the air, a weight on his shoulders. He reached the footlocker. It was made of olive drab steel, with the words U.S. Army Medical Corps stenciled on the lid, the paint faded and peeling. Another layer of mystery. What was an Army medical locker doing in a private rail car? He knelt and examined the latches. They were stiff, but not locked. He lifted them, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He took another breath and lifted the lid. The contents were perfectly preserved. The locker had been airtight. On top lay a thick, leather-bound ledger. Beside it, a stack of letters tied with a faded ribbon, and beneath them, a series of wax-sealed cylinders, the kind used to protect important documents. He picked up the ledger. The leather was cold and supple. He opened it to the first page. The handwriting was neat, precise. A doctor's script. The first entry was dated May 17th, 1928. Patient 0 admitted today. Name, Thomas Abernathy. Age, 22. Hired on with the tunnel crew for the new Cascade line. Presenting with high fever, respiratory distress, and a peculiar rash on his extremities. We have isolated him in car 7. The company foreman, Mr. Harris, is concerned about a panic. He has insisted on absolute discretion. Elias's blood ran cold. Car 7. This car. He turned the pages, his hands trembling slightly. The entries came day after day. More names. Miller, Jensen, O'Connell, Rossi. Young men, miners and laborers, all with the same symptoms. The doctor, a man named Alistair Finch, chronicled their decline with detached scientific precision. But between the lines, Elias could read a growing sense of horror and helplessness. The illness was swift and brutal. It did not respond to any treatment he had. By June, there were 30 men in the car. The ledger entries became shorter, more desperate. Another one lost this morning. We are running out of space. The company has posted guards. No one is allowed to leave the quarantine zone. They tell us it is for the good of the project. I feel like a jailer. He found the last entry, dated July 2nd, 1928. Only 5 of us left. The men are gone. It took me as well last night. The fever is high. My hands shake as I write this. Mr. Harris came to the door today. He would not open it. He said the company had made a decision. They are closing the line. They are going to bury the car. Bury us. To protect the investment. To erase the outbreak. He called it a necessary sacrifice. He promised they would tell our families we died in a tunnel collapse. A clean story. I have gathered the men's letters. I am sealing them in this chest. If this is ever found, let the world know what was done here. Let them know we did not die in a collapse. We were left in the dark. My name is Dr. Alistair Finch. Remember us. Elias closed the book. The weight of it in his hands was immense. He looked around the empty car, at the silent cots. This was not a tomb. It was a crime scene. 30 men, plus a doctor, buried alive by their employer to protect a balance sheet. A story scrubbed from history. He thought of the name on the lookout tower, Angel's Perch. Perhaps it was not a warning. Perhaps it was a vigil. He picked up the stack of letters. He could not bring himself to read them. They were too sacred, too personal. These were the last words of dying men to their wives, their mothers, their children. Words that had never been delivered. He then looked at the wax-sealed cylinders. He carefully broke the seal on one and unrolled the document inside. It was a detailed medical chart,
but attached to it was a hand-drawn map.
It showed the location of the burial site, the planned route of the now-defunct rail line, and, ominously, a second location, circled in red with a note. Possible second quarantine site, Car 4, unconfirmed. The injustice of it was a physical force, a pressure in his chest. He had come to this mountain seeking nothing, wanting to be responsible for no one and nothing. And he had found 31 souls who had been left behind. The parallel was a cruel, cosmic joke. He had run from one ghost, only to find a legion of them. He packed the ledger, the letters, and the cylinders carefully into his Everly stock pack. The weight was more than just paper and leather. It was the weight of a promise. Remember us. As he slid back out of the car into the fading light, Ghost was waiting, his body rigid, his gaze fixed not on Elias, but on the trail leading down the mountain. A low growl rumbled in the dog's chest. Elias froze, listening. He heard it then.
The sound of an engine, a heavy diesel, grinding its way up the old logging road far below. Someone was coming. They were not coming for him. They were coming for the car. The journey down the mountain was a calculated risk. Elias moved with a speed and stealth he had not called upon in years, Ghost a gray shadow at his heels. He avoided the trail, sticking to the dense timber, using the terrain for cover. The sound of the engine grew louder, closer. They were making better time than he had anticipated. He had to get to the town of Havenwood, to the county clerk's office, before whoever was coming reached the site. The ledger in his pack felt like it weighed 100 pounds, a burden of proof he could not afford to lose. He reached the edge of the tree line above the old logging road, just as a heavy-duty pickup truck, a modern Ford F350, rumbled past. It was followed by a flatbed truck carrying a small bulldozer. He dropped flat, pulling Ghost down beside him. The trucks were new, unmarked except for a small, discreet logo on the doors, a stylized WTR, Westward Timber and Resource. He recognized the name from a sign outside a new, polished office on the edge of town. They were a recent arrival, buying up old land claims and timber rights. They knew. They knew the car was here, and they were coming to remove it. His discovery had not been an accident. He had likely tripped some silent, modern sensor, a seismic monitor, or a magnetic anomaly detector left to guard the secret. His digging had sent an alert. The 50-year-old promise of Dr. Finch was about to be broken for good. He waited until the trucks were out of sight before continuing his descent. The need for haste was a fire in his veins, but he forced himself to remain disciplined. Rushing led to mistakes. He reached Havenwood just after noon, a ghost himself, emerging from the forest behind the town's small residential area. He was caked in mud, his face scratched, his knuckles raw. He looked like a man who had been wrestling with the earth. And in a way, he had. He made his way to the county courthouse, a sturdy brick building from the 1920s that housed all the local government offices. He walked through the heavy oak doors and found the county clerk's office. A woman sat behind a high counter, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun. She wore wire-rimmed glasses and looked up at him with an expression of polite inquiry that did not quite mask her disapproval of his appearance. Her nameplate read, Martha Thorne, County Clerk. "Can I help you?" Her voice was crisp, efficient.
"I need to see property records," Elias said, his own voice raspy. "Old ones. Land surveys from the 1920s. She eyed him for a long moment. "That's archive material, not generally available for public browsing. What parcel are you interested in?" "It's not a specific parcel. It's an area, up near Angel's Perch." Her expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "That's federal land now, national forest.
but it was originally deeded to the Northern Dominion Rail Company. Their charter is a matter of public record, but it's dense. What exactly are you looking for? He hesitated. He couldn't just tell her he'd found a buried train car full of dead miners. She would think he was crazy. He needed to build a foundation, to lead her to the truth through her own records. He unslung his pack and carefully took out the map he had found, the one drawn by Dr. Finch. He smoothed the brittle paper on the counter.
I'm a historian, he lied, the word feeling foreign in his mouth. I'm researching abandoned rail lines. I found this map. It indicates a spur line that isn't on any official survey. I'm trying to verify it. Martha Thorne looked at the hand-drawn map. Her professional curiosity seemed to override her initial skepticism. She peered at it over her glasses, her finger tracing the hand-drawn line. "That's impossible," she said, more to herself than to him. "The grade is too steep. They never would have been able to lay track there." "That's what I thought," Elias said, pressing his small advantage. "But the map is very specific. It mentions a quarantine site. Car 7. The word quarantine hung in the air between them. Martha's eyes flickered up from the map to his face. She saw the exhaustion, the dirt, but also the grim seriousness in his eyes. She was no fool. She had been the county clerk for 30 years. She knew the stories and secrets the land held. "Wait here," she said, her tone all business. She disappeared into a back room, the archives. Elias waited, his senses on high alert. The quiet office felt like a temporary sanctuary, but he knew the men with the bulldozer were already on the mountain. Time was running out. Ghost, who he had left tied outside, let out a single low bark, a signal that someone was approaching. The office door opened, but it was not Martha. A man in his late 60s, with a wild shock of white hair and a tweed jacket that had seen better days, entered, carrying a stack of books. He nodded to Elias and made a beeline for the archives. "Martha, I think I found a reference to the lost locomotive legend in a primary source," he called out, his voice booming with academic excitement. Martha emerged from the back, carrying a massive, dust-covered ledger book, far older than the one Elias had found. "Not now, Alistair," she said, her voice strained. She placed the book on the counter and opened it. "This is the original charter and survey log for Northern Dominion. Every mile of track, every land purchase." The man she called Alistair peered over her shoulder, his interest piqued. "What have you got there?" "A gentleman with a question about an impossible spur line," Martha said, running her finger down a page of spidery cursive. She stopped. "Here. Section 14, Township 3. The land around Angel's Perch. It was leased from the federal government in 1927 for tunneling and resource extraction. The lease was terminated abruptly in July 1928. Reason cited: geological instability and project non-viability. She looked at Elias. "A clean story," she said, echoing the words from the doctor's journal. The academic Alistair leaned closer. "July 1928. That's fascinating. That's the same month as the Havenwood Panic, as the old papers called it. A supposed influenza outbreak that never really materialized. It was all very mysterious. The company sealed the town for 2 weeks." Elias felt the pieces clicking into place. The company hadn't just buried the car. They had locked down the whole area to control the narrative, to ensure no one went looking for the missing men. "There's more," Elias said, his voice low. He reached into his pack and placed the doctor's leather-bound ledger on the counter next to the county's official record. "This is why the project was not viable." Martha and Alistair stared at the book. Alistair, recognizing it for what it was, reached for it with a reverence Elias understood. "May I?" he asked, his voice a whisper. Elias nodded. The old historian opened the ledger, his eyes scanning the first page.
a sharp intake of breath.
He looked up at Elias, his face pale.
"My God," he whispered. "Dr. Alastair Finch. He was my great-uncle. He went missing in 1928. The family was told he died in a climbing accident." The connection was a jolt of electricity in the quiet room. This was no longer just history for the old professor. It was family. "He didn't die in an accident," Elias said softly. "He was a hero. He stayed with his patients, and he kept a record." For the next hour, the small office became a council of war. Alastair, his academic excitement replaced by a grim determination, read from his great-uncle's journal, his voice thick with emotion. Martha Thorne, the consummate professional, cross-referenced the names of the dead miners with old census records and birth certificates, finding ghosts in the machine of bureaucracy. One by one, the 31 forgotten men were given back their names, their histories.
They were no longer just entries in a log. They were sons, husbands, and fathers from Havenwood and the surrounding valleys.
"This is a crime of historic proportions," Alastair said, his hand resting on the journal. "Westward Timber and Resource must be the successor to Northern Dominion. They must have the original corporate records. They know about the car. They're not excavating. They're destroying evidence." "But we have no authority up there," Martha said, her face grim. "It's national forest land. That's federal jurisdiction. By the time I get a Forest Service ranger or a federal marshal to understand what's happening, it will be too late. They'll have that car cut up and hauled away." The office door opened again. This time it was a man who did not belong in the dusty courthouse. He was in his late 40s, dressed in an expensive suit that looked out of place, and a smile that did not reach his eyes.
He was flanked by a younger, fitter man in a security polo shirt who stood by the door, his arms crossed.
"Martha, a pleasure as always," the man in the suit said, his voice smooth as polished stone. "I hope we're not interrupting." Martha Thorne stood up, her posture rigid. "Mr. Jennings, what can I do for you?" "Just tying up some loose ends," Jennings said, his gaze sweeping the room. It passed over Alastair and the books, and then it landed on Elias. The smile faltered for a fraction of a second. His eyes flickered down to the mud on Elias's boots, the scratches on his face, the Eberlestock pack on the floor beside him. He knew. "We're beginning a reclamation project on some of our old holdings up in the high country. Just routine environmental cleanup. I came down to file the necessary work permits." "Reclamation?" Martha's voice was cold steel. "On land you terminated the lease on 90 years ago?" Jennings's smile returned, fully formed. "A corporate responsibility initiative. We're cleaning up the messes of the past. It's good PR." He looked directly at Elias. "You look like you've been enjoying our beautiful wilderness. It's easy to get turned around up there. Find things that are best left alone. Things that are out of context." The threat was unspoken but perfectly clear. Elias stood his ground, his expression unreadable. He had faced men like Jennings before, men who used language to obscure truth, who talked about collateral damage and necessary sacrifices. They were the most dangerous kind of enemy, because they believed their own justifications.
"Some things have no context," Elias said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of the mountain.
"They're just the truth." Jennings's eyes hardened. "The truth is a matter of perspective and documentation." He nodded toward the door. "My company has a long and storied history in this region. We have the resources to protect that history. It would be a shame if a private citizen, a transient with no ties to the community, were to interfere with a legitimate business operation based on some historical misunderstanding." Ghost, still tied outside, began to bark,
a deep, percussive warning that cut through the strained silence in the office. It was a sound of imminent threat. But the threat was already in the room. The confrontation in the clerk's office was a silent war fought with glances and veiled words. Mr. Jennings, the polished face of Westward Timber and Resource, held his ground, his placid smile a mask for the immense corporate power he represented.
Elias stood opposite him, a solitary, immovable object, his presence a quiet accusation. Between them, Martha Thorne and Dr. Alistair Finch were the custodians of a truth that was rapidly becoming dangerous. "I believe you'll find our permits are all in order," Jennings said, placing a slim leather portfolio on the counter. It landed with a soft, expensive sound. "A simple matter of removing some industrial debris left behind by our predecessors, an environmental hazard." "A hazard you've ignored for 90 years, Alistair shot back, his voice trembling with a mixture of grief and rage. "That debris is my great-uncle's grave. It's the grave of 30 other men." Jennings turned his calm, dismissive gaze on the old historian. "Dr. Finch, is it? I've read your work. Passionate, a bit romantic. You're dealing with local legends, stories that have been twisted over time. Our records, the actual legally binding records, indicate a construction accident. Tragic, but not uncommon for the era. The material we're recovering is simply a piece of abandoned equipment." "Then why was it buried?" Elias asked. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, which made the question land with even greater force. Jennings' eyes narrowed on Elias. "Who are you, exactly?" "He's a concerned citizen," Martha Thorne cut in, her voice sharp as broken glass. "And he's brought evidence that contradicts your clean story." She gestured to the doctor's ledger on the counter. Jennings glanced at the ledger but did not touch it. "Ah, a diary. A personal account written under duress, likely in a state of delirium. Hardly a legal document. It's sad, of course, but it's not evidence. It's an artifact, a piece of subjective history. What we are doing is based on objective fact and legal right." The younger man in the security shirt, the one who had been standing by the door, shifted his weight. His eyes, unlike his boss's, were not on the documents. They were on Elias. He took in the worn field jacket, the military-grade pack, the way Elias stood, balanced, centered, not relaxed, but coiled. He recognized it. He was looking at a fellow professional. Elias met the younger man's gaze for a brief second. He saw a flicker of conflict, of recognition. The man, whose name tag read Cole, gave a barely perceptible nod, a sign of respect between soldiers, even those on opposite sides of a line. "You can't go up there," Martha said, her authority ringing in her voice. "I am impounding these records as evidence of a potential crime. I'm contacting the Forest Service and the State Attorney General." Jennings actually laughed, a short, humorless bark. "Martha, be reasonable. By the time your bureaucratic wheels even begin to turn, my reclamation will be complete. The site will be remediated. There will be nothing for your rangers to find but some freshly turned earth. I'm trying to be civil here. I'm offering you a chance to step aside and let us handle this quietly." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Think of the town, the scandal, the media. Raking up a 90-year-old tragedy helps no one. It just opens old wounds. Let them rest in peace." "They were never allowed to rest in peace," Alistair said, his voice choked. "They were erased." Elias felt a familiar coldness spread through him. It was the logic of the powerful. The logic that valued clean stories over messy truths. The logic that had left Ben on that dusty ridge. He reached into his pack, his movements slow and deliberate. Jennings tensed, and his man Cole shifted forward, his hand moving subtly toward his hip. But Elias did not pull out a weapon. He pulled out the small bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. He placed them on the counter. "These were in the car," Elias said, his voice just above a whisper. "Letters to their families. They were never sent. The letters were a tangible manifestation of the human cost. They were not a ledger or a map. They were the last words of dying men." For the first time, Jennings's composure cracked. He looked at the letters as if they were venomous. This was a complication his legal team couldn't argue away. This was a story the media would love. "These men have families," Elias continued, his gaze locked on Jennings. "Descendants, right here in this valley. They don't deserve a clean story. They deserve the truth." Jennings stared at Elias, his mask of civility stripped away, revealing the cold, pragmatic core beneath. "You have no idea what you are meddling with," he said, his voice low and venomous. "You're a man with no name, no stake in this. You should have kept walking." He straightened his suit jacket and turned to leave. "Cole, let's go. We have a schedule to keep." As they reached the door, Elias spoke again. There was a second location circled on the doctor's map, Car 4, unconfirmed. Jennings froze, his back to the room. He turned his head slowly, his eyes burning with cold fury. Elias had not just found a grave, he had found a map to another one. The problem was bigger than Jennings had thought. His quiet reclamation was threatening to become a full-blown excavation of corporate sins. "This changes nothing," Jennings snarled, before turning and walking out, Cole following in his wake. The moment the door closed, the tension in the room broke. Alistair sank into a chair, his face in his hands. Martha picked up her phone. "I'm calling the state police," she said, her fingers trembling slightly. "But he's right. They'll be up that mountain before anyone can stop them." "No, they won't," Elias said. He was already slinging his pack over his shoulder. He looked at Martha. "How long can you delay him? Can you find a problem with his permits? An injunction?" Martha's eyes, red-rimmed but fierce, met his. "I can give you 24 hours. I'll find an endangered species of paperwork he forgot to file. It won't hold up for long, but it will buy you a day." "It's enough," Elias said. He looked at Alistair. "Doctor, your great-uncle was a brave man. He left you a job to do. Get those names, those letters, to the press, to the families. Jennings is afraid of the truth coming out. So let's let it out." Alistair looked up, a new fire in his old eyes. "I will," he said. "I'll make them remember." Elias nodded and turned to leave. Ghost was waiting for him, whining softly, his leash tangled around the leg of a bench. Elias knelt and untangled it, scratching the dog behind the ears. "Sorry, boy. Looks like the quiet life is on hold." Ghost licked his hand, his gaze fixed on the mountain that loomed over the town. A storm was building in the west, the sky the color of a fresh bruise. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of rain and ozone. It was going to be a long night. Elias had a 24-hour head start, but he was one man and a dog against a crew with heavy machinery. He couldn't stop them by force. He had to stop them with the truth. He had to make the sight so visible, so undeniable, that Jennings wouldn't be able to simply erase it. He had to turn a grave into a monument, and he had to do it before the storm broke. He moved back up the mountain, not with the stealth of his descent, but with the speed of a man on a mission. The approaching storm was a palpable presence, the wind moaning through the high pines, the air thick and electric. It was a race against two clocks. The one on Martha Thorne's desk, ticking away his 24 hours, and the one in the sky, threatening to unleash its fury and turn the mountain into an impassable morass of mud and rock.
He reached the site as dusk was painting the churning clouds in shades of violent purple. The railcar sat in its earthen scar, a dark, silent testament. He had a plan, born of desperation and the tactical knowledge of his past life. He couldn't move the car, but he could anchor it. He could make it a part of the mountain itself.
He took the entrenching tool and began to dig again. Not to uncover, but to secure. He dug deep trenches around the exposed corners of the car. Then, using the lever pull from before and a system of smaller logs as rollers, he began the Herculean task of finding and moving the largest rocks he could manage into those trenches, wetting them against the car's frame. It was brutal, back-breaking work. Every muscle screamed in protest. His hands, already raw, were torn and bleeding. But he worked with a frantic, focused energy, the memory of Ben's face driving him on. He had failed to anchor his friend. He would not fail these 31 souls. As darkness fell, the first drops of rain began to fall, fat and cold. The wind howled, ripping at his jacket. He worked by the beam of his headlamp, a tiny pinprick of light in a vast, roaring darkness. Ghost stayed close, a sentinel in the storm, his body pressed against Elias's leg whenever he paused, a silent offering of solidarity. The dog seemed to understand the stakes, his usual calm replaced by a tense vigilance. Sometime after midnight, exhausted and soaked to the bone, Elias knew he had done all he could with rocks and earth. The car was more deeply entrenched than before. It would slow them down, but a bulldozer would still make short work of it. He needed more. He needed to expose the truth for all to see. He climbed onto the roof of the car, the metal slick with rain. He had one more tool in his pack, one he had not used in years. A small spool of military-grade tripwire and a set of chemical light sticks. He had carried them out of habit, a ghost of his old profession. Tonight, they would have a new purpose. He worked carefully, anchoring one end of the tripwire to a tree and the other to the latch of the now unbolted door. He rigged it so that any attempt to move the car or force the door would snap the wire, which in turn would break the light sticks he had bundled together just inside the doorway.
It wouldn't stop them,
But it would flood the interior of the car with bright, chemical green light. It would illuminate the cots, the medical supplies, the empty spaces where men had died. It would turn the tomb into a spectacle, a last defiant flare from the darkness. As he finished, a flash of lightning split the sky, followed by a deafening crack of thunder that shook the ground. In the brief, stark illumination, he saw them. 2 sets of headlights, winding their way up the logging road below. Jennings hadn't waited for the 24 hours. He was coming. Now. Elias scrambled off the car and took up a position in the dense trees 100 yards up the slope, a vantage point that gave him a clear view of the site. He lay flat on the wet ground, Ghost pressed against him, the dog's low growl a constant vibration. The rain was a torrential downpour now, turning the clearing into a sea of mud.
The 2 trucks, the F-350 and the flatbed with the dozer, slid to a halt at the edge of the clearing. Jennings got out of the pickup, shouting to be heard over the storm. He was no longer in a suit. He wore expensive-looking rain gear, but his face was tight with fury. Cole and 2 other burly men got out, their faces grim. "What is this?" Jennings roared, seeing the freshly dug earth and the rocks wedged against the car. "He's been back!" He pointed a finger at the car. "I don't care what it takes. Get that thing on the flatbed. Now! Cut it up if you have to. I want it gone by sunrise." The men set to work with a grim efficiency. One of them, the dozer operator, unloaded the small machine. Its engine coughed to life, a guttural roar that challenged the thunder. Cole and the other man started attaching heavy chains to the exposed end of the rail car. Elias watched, his heart a cold, hard knot in his chest.
His traps were meager defenses against this kind of industrial might.
It was all happening too fast. He had failed. He had bought a day, but it wasn't enough. The story was about to be erased forever. Then something happened that he hadn't anticipated. As Cole was trying to secure a chain around the undercarriage of the car, the muddy ground, already loosened by Elias's digging and saturated by the rain, gave way. The corner of the heavy rail car shifted, sinking deeper into the mud and pinning Cole's leg against one of the rocks Elias had so painstakingly put in place. Cole screamed, a sharp cry of pain that was nearly swallowed by the storm. Jennings spun around. "What's wrong?" "My leg! I'm pinned!" Cole yelled, his voice strained with agony. The other men rushed to help, trying to use pry bars to move the car, but it was too heavy, too deeply mired. The bulldozer operator started to bring the machine around, but the ground was too slick, the angle too steep. Jennings stared, his face a mask of cold calculation. Every second they wasted here increased the risk of discovery. Elias saw the look in his eyes. It was the same look he had seen on the face of his commanding officer on the radio screen 10 years ago. The look of a man weighing a life against a mission. "Leave him!" Jennings shouted. "Get the dozer. Push the whole thing, the car, the rocks, all of it, into the ravine. We'll come back for him later." The dozer operator hesitated, his face pale in the intermittent flashes of lightning. Cole stared at his boss in disbelief and horror. "You can't just leave me here. I have $100 million corporate merger riding on this site being clean by morning," Jennings screamed back, his voice cracking. "You are acceptable collateral damage. Now move it!" And in that moment, Elias was no longer on a mountain in the Cascades. He was in the Hindu Kush. The man pinned was not Cole. It was Ben. The man giving the order was not Jennings. It was the voice on the radio. The choice was the same. The mission or the man. Protect the evidence or save a life. Ghost whined, a high, keening sound, his eyes fixed on the scene below. He was looking at Cole, at the man trapped and about to be abandoned. The dog, his moral compass, was pointing the way. Elias did not hesitate. He broke cover, sliding and running down the muddy slope, a dark figure emerging from the storm. "No!" he shouted, his voice a raw command that cut through the wind. Jennings and his men spun around, startled by his sudden appearance. Jennings's face contorted with rage. "You! I should have known!" Elias ignored him. He ran straight to the pinned man, dropping to his knees in the mud beside Cole. "Talk to me," he said, his voice calm, professional. "Where's the pressure?" Cole, his face white with pain, pointed. "My ankle. It's trapped. I think it's broken." Elias assessed the situation in a second. The car was balanced precariously. The bulldozer pushing it would not just bury the evidence. It would crush Cole. He looked at the dozer operator. "Shut it down! Now!" The operator, caught between two opposing orders, looked at Jennings, then at the desperate scene in front of him. He killed the engine. The sudden silence was broken only by the rain and Cole's pained breathing. "What are you doing?" Jennings raged at Elias. "This doesn't concern you." "You're about to kill him," Elias said, not looking up from his work. He was examining the rock, the angle of the car. "I need leverage. A pry bar." Cole's partner, the other security man, looked at Jennings, then at Cole, and made his decision. He ran and got the longest pry bar from the truck and handed it to Elias. "This is insane," Jennings sputtered, pulling out his phone, trying to get a signal. "You're all fired." Elias wedged the pry bar into the small space between the car and the rock. "On my count, I'm going to lift. You pull him clear," he said to the other man.
"Ghost, watch him." Ghost moved to Jennings's side, not touching him, but his presence was a clear and unambiguous threat. A low growl emanated from his chest. Jennings froze, his eyes wide with fear. He had dealt with lawyers and executives. He did not know how to deal with 120 pounds of determined, loyal animal. "Ready?" Elias grunted, his muscles straining. 1, 2, 3! He threw his entire body weight into the pry bar. The steel groaned. The massive rail car shifted just an inch, but it was enough. The other man pulled Cole free with a grunt. Elias let the car settle back, his body screaming with the effort. He had done it. He had made the choice. He hadn't saved the mission.
He hadn't protected the evidence. He had saved the man. He had not left him behind. In the driving rain, on the side of a forgotten mountain, he had finally, after 10 long years, corrected his own history. As he stood up, panting, a wave of relief so profound it almost brought him to his knees washed over him. The knot in his gut, the one that had been there for a decade, was gone. And in that moment, as if on cue, the darkness below was split by flashing red and blue lights. The sound of sirens, faint at first, then growing louder, drifted up the mountain. Martha's 24 hours were up. Or maybe someone else had made a call. Elias glanced at Cole, who, despite his pain, gave him a look of profound gratitude. Jennings saw the lights and knew it was over. The secret was out. His face crumpled, the face of a man who had just lost an empire. He looked at Elias, at the man who had cost him everything, not with a gun or a threat, but with a simple act of loyalty. The storm began to subside, the torrential rain softening to a steady drizzle. The mountain was quiet again, save for the approaching sirens. Elias stood over the rail car, a guardian in the graying dawn, Ghost at his side. He had come to this place to be forgotten. Instead, he had found something that deserved to be remembered. And in doing so, he had found a way to remember himself. If this chapter of one man's stand against the forgetting of the past stirred something in you, if it reminded you of the power of loyalty and the courage it takes to make the right choice, even when it costs you everything, then please take a moment to like and share this story. Leave a comment below about a time you chose to remember when the world wanted to forget. Your engagement helps us continue to bring these stories of quiet miracles and profound faith to light. Subscribe to our channel so we can continue this journey together. Sometimes the Lord does not ask us to move mountains, but simply to stay and listen to the story they have to tell. The morning after the storm was unnaturally calm. A gentle mist rose from the damp earth, shrouding the trees in a soft gray veil. The air was clean, washed new. The site around the rail car was now a place of careful, ordered activity. 2 state police cruisers and a truck from the National Forest Service were parked where Jennings's vehicles had been. Uniformed officers and rangers moved with a quiet reverence, securing the area with yellow tape. It was no longer an environmental hazard. It was a protected historical site. A crime scene. Elias sat on a fallen log a short distance away, Ghost's head resting on his thigh. He had given his statement, a simple, factual account. He left out the part about his past, about Ben. That was his own story, and it had found its resolution here, in the mud and the rain. He was just a man who had found something and done the right thing. It was enough. He watched as an ambulance crew carefully loaded Cole onto a stretcher. The young man, his leg now splinted, called out to him. "Hey, I don't know your name." "Elias." "Elias, thank you," Cole said, his voice earnest. "He was going to leave me." He paused, then added, "I made the call. When he gave that order, I knew what kind of man he was. I knew what kind of man you were. I had my phone in my pocket. Elias nodded. The conflicted insider. The man who made a choice. He had seen it before. Morality wasn't about a uniform or a side. It was about a decision made in a moment of pressure. He saw Jennings, no longer looking powerful but small and defeated, talking to a state police detective. His reign of clean stories was over. Alistair Finch was there too, his tweed jacket damp, his face a mixture of sorrow and vindication. He was talking to a young reporter from the local paper, the doctor's ledger open in his hands. The names of the 31 would not be forgotten again. Their families would finally know the truth. A car pulled up, one Elias did not recognize. A woman got out. She was in her late 30s, with dark hair and a familiar, weary set to her eyes. His eyes. It was his sister, Sarah. He hadn't seen her in 3 years. He stood up, his body stiff and aching. She walked toward him, her gaze taking in his disheveled state, the cuts, the mud, the exhaustion. "Martha Thorne called me," she said, her voice quiet. "She said you might need someone." She stopped a few feet from him. "I was worried." "I'm all right," he said, the words feeling inadequate. For years he had kept her and everyone else at arm's length, believing his solitude was a penance he had to pay alone. He had been wrong. His isolation hadn't been a penance. It had been an abdication. "You look terrible," she said, a faint smile touching her lips. It was their old language, the one from before. "You should see the other guy," he replied, and the smile on her face widened. She stepped forward, and for the first time in a decade, he didn't pull away. She wrapped her arms around him, and he stood there, stiffly at first. Then, slowly, he let his own arms come up and hold on to her. He rested his chin on her shoulder, the scent of her familiar shampoo, a sudden, sharp memory of home, of a life he thought he had lost forever. The weight he had been carrying for so long, the weight of his failure, finally began to lift. It wasn't gone, but he was no longer carrying it alone. "Let's go home, Eli," she whispered. "Just for a little while." He nodded against her shoulder. Home. It was a word he hadn't let himself think about for a very long time. A week later, Elias stood once more on the mountain, but this time he was not alone. A small crowd had gathered, descendants of the men from Car 7, reporters, townspeople. Alistair Finch, standing before the now fully excavated rail car, read the names of the 31 men, his voice clear and strong. Each name was met with a quiet reverence. The car was to be preserved, right where it was, as a permanent memorial. The state had declared it a historical landmark. Elias stood at the back of the crowd, his sister by his side, Ghost sitting faithfully at his feet. He was wearing a clean shirt, a gift from Sarah. His M65 jacket was folded neatly in his pack. He didn't feel like he needed the armor anymore. Martha Thorne found him. "The state is looking for a custodian for the site," she said, her gaze direct. "A warden. To live on site, protect it, guide visitors. It's federal land, but they want someone local. Someone who understands the story. Alistair and I recommended you." Elias looked at the rail car, at the silent pines, at the vast expanse of the sky. He had come here to escape the world, but the world had found him. It had given him a new mission, not of violence or stealth, but of stewardship, of remembrance. He looked at his sister, who gave him a small, encouraging nod. He looked down at Ghost, who looked back up at him, his old, wise eyes seeming to say, "Well, this is where we belong, isn't it?" "I'll do it," Elias said. The words felt right. They felt like peace.
Later that day, after the crowds had gone, Elias walked to the edge of the clearing and looked out over the valley. The world below seemed different now, not a place to run from, but a place he was connected to. He took out the marathon watch, the symbol of his old life, of the time he was always running against. He unclasped it and held it in his palm. For a moment he considered throwing it into the ravine, a final severing of his past. But he didn't. He closed his hand around it and slipped it into his pocket. The past was not something you could throw away.
It was something you learned to carry. It was a part of who you were. He had finally learned how to carry his. He turned and walked back toward the rail car, toward his new home. Ghost trotted beside him, his tail giving a slow, steady wag. The mountain was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was not the empty silence of forgetting, but the rich, resonant silence of memory, of peace earned, of a promise kept. The sun was setting, and for the first time in a long time, Elias Vance was not afraid of the dark. As our story comes to a close, we are left with the quiet miracle of a second chance. Elias came to the mountains seeking an end, a place to let his story fade into the silence. But God, in his infinite and often mysterious wisdom, had a different plan. He did not offer a thunderous revelation, but a quiet insistence, the nudge of a faithful dog, the discovery of a forgotten promise. If you are watching this while carrying the weight of a past silence, a failure you cannot forgive, or a memory you believe has defined you, let this story be a testament to the fact that redemption is not always about going back and fixing what was broken. Sometimes it is about standing firm in the present, choosing loyalty, and answering the call to protect the forgotten. It is about the strength to stay when everything in you wants to run. God's work is often done in these quiet moments, through the steadfast loyalty of an animal, the integrity of a public servant, the courage of one man to say, "No further." These are the miracles that remake our world, not by changing the past, but by sanctifying the present. May you find the courage to listen to the whispers of your own heart, to honor the forgotten stories you encounter, and to accept the grace of a new beginning when it is offered. May God bless you and keep you, and may He make His face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. Please share this story with someone who might need to hear it, and join our community by subscribing so that we may continue to find and share these testaments to faith and the enduring power of the human spirit. Amen.